I work for a janitorial company that cleans office buildings in the city. We have set schedules for each building, and most of the time they request cleanings to be done outside of work hours. So, most jobs I did were between 5 p.m. and 7 a.m. It varied depending on the building we were servicing that day. On this night, I was working with my coworker, RJ, and we were set to do a basic cleaning in a 5-story office building. The floors in this place were really big, mostly filled with rows of cubicles. This was booked for our whole 8-hour shift, but it wasn't uncommon for it to take longer. We started working at 6. RJ went to the top floor to work his way down, and I started on the bottom floor to work my way up, planning to meet each other on the middle 3rd floor and finish up together. I started by rolling my trash bin over to each cubicle and taking out their trash, then the bathroom and main offices. Then I got my cleaning supplies from my cart and started cleaning the bathroom. While I was scrubbing the sinks though, I heard the front door of the building open. I thought RJ had just forgotten something in the van, but a couple minutes went by and I didn't hear the door open again. Once I finished scrubbing the sinks, I went to the front door and looked outside, seeing the van was off and the doors were closed, and it looked empty. I figured I just didn't notice him coming back in, or maybe I didn't notice him leaving, and the door opening was him actually coming back inside. Whatever, I thought. It wasn't a big deal. I went back to work. After an hour or so, I finished up on the 1st floor and moved to the 2nd. This floor was almost identical to the 1st, except it had a small reception desk in front of the stairs. I started with the trash again, and while doing this, I heard another door open. I could tell it was from upstairs, but I didn't know which floor until I heard footsteps. They walked slowly across the floor above me, toward the back of the building. I knew it was on the 3rd floor above me, but RJ could not have finished 2 floors in just over an hour. It just wasn't possible. I went to the stairs and onto the 3rd floor to see what he was doing. There was a main door, and behind it was a long hallway filled with closed-in offices. I listened for a second to see if I could pinpoint where he was, but it was silent. RJ? I took a few more steps into the hallway, but I started getting creeped out. I backed out and went to the 4th floor. Right when I opened the door, I saw RJ standing in the middle of the room, cleaning with his headphones in. Hey, were you on the 3rd floor just now? He took his headphones out and said no, looking at me like he was confused. Oh, okay, sorry. I'm just starting on my 2nd floor, so I'll see you in a couple hours. He nodded and went back to work. I went back downstairs and splashed some water on my face. I didn't feel that tired, but I knew I had to be imagining these things. At least, I thought so. I turned the sink off and patted my face down with a paper towel. Then, just before I left the bathroom, I heard a door open. It was from the main area on my floor. I waited in the bathroom as whoever was out there started walking around. I stayed for a minute, then opened the bathroom door just barely enough to look into the main room. In the far back was a man. He was facing away from me, walking slowly down the aisles of cubicles. It was so strange because he was just walking, not looking around or doing anything else. I watched this guy walk all the way down, then he stopped by the window. I walked further out and into the main room. Hey, you okay, man? I don't think you're supposed to be in here, I said, trying to sound nice and not too provoking. The guy turned around and looked at me. He was far away, but I could see emptiness in his eyes, like he was looking straight through me. I waited only a couple seconds for a response before I quickly walked out of the room. He still didn't move or say anything. I ran up to the 4th floor where RJ was. He was still cleaning and didn't seem to have noticed anything. I convinced him to come down to the van with me, where we called the police and I explained what happened. The police came a few minutes later and searched the building, but came out empty-handed. They reviewed the security footage of that night though, and saw the man walk inside around the same time that I said I heard the door open. He stayed in the stairwell for a long time. Then he walked up to the 3rd floor and slowly walked around each room. Then he went to the 2nd floor, where you could see him walk down to the window. After my interaction with him, the man left the building as I went to get RJ. His intentions are unknown, but that empty look he gave me and the way he was just walking around were some of the creepiest things I've ever seen. And 4 months later, even with his face clearly shown on the footage, no one has been able to find or identify him. I had just gotten home from work at 8. I picked up some food on the way home, so I just sat down at the table to eat while watching YouTube on my phone. While I was still taking my food out of the bag and setting it on the table, the doorbell rang. It was raining outside, and I had literally gotten home 20 seconds ago, so I was not expecting someone to be at my door so suddenly. I went over to the front door and opened it. A man stood on my porch, looking soaked and cold. "Hi, can I help you?" I said. The man asked me if I'd let him take shelter in my house for the night because he didn't have anywhere else to stay. I felt bad for him, but I wasn't going to just let some random man stay in my house. I apologized and said no, then closed the door. I waited to make sure he left, but after a minute I hadn't heard any footsteps leaving. I looked out the peephole and saw the man still standing there. He was facing the driveway, looking out into the rain. I thought he was maybe taking shelter on my porch for a bit before going back out, which I guess I didn't mind, so long as he left within the next few minutes. I went back to my food and sat down to eat. I had a lot of stuff from work on my mind, so that man on the porch wasn't a big concern of mine. When I finished eating, I put a show on and rested my eyes for a while. 30 or so minutes later, the doorbell rang again. I almost didn't even want to answer, but when I looked out the peephole, I saw a young boy, looking to be maybe 13 or 14 years old. I opened the door, and the boy was about to ask me something, but I interrupted him and asked what he was doing out here alone and where his parents were. He paused, like he was thinking of a response. But then he just ignored my questions and said he was looking for shelter because he didn't have anywhere to stay. There was something wrong, and I knew it the moment those words came out of his mouth. With the boy being so young though, it was a really strange situation. I told him to stay on the porch for just a minute. Then I closed the door and ran to get my phone. I had a feeling that if I told the boy I was calling the police, then he'd run away. So I didn't tell him. I called 911 and let them know that a boy was at my house claiming to be homeless. I made the call quick, then ran back to the door. I opened the door quickly, but standing on my porch were 3 grown men, including the one I'd seen earlier that night. I slammed the door shut immediately as one of the men rushed at me and pushed their body against the door. I locked it just before he turned the handle. I was screaming and crying as I backed away from the door. They were pounding on it and tried to force the handle to turn. After 30 seconds though, it went quiet. I heard footsteps running away, and then it was over. Just the sound of rain hitting the roof. The police came and took a report from me with descriptions of the men and the boy that I saw. They had a similar incident earlier that week of likely the same group using the boy as bait to get the homeowner to let them inside. Then the whole group came in and violently robbed them. One of the men was caught a few days later while robbing a store, But as for the boy and the other two men, I don't think they were ever found. There was a period in my life when my parents were going through a rough patch. I lived alone in a small apartment and took my 6-year-old brother in while my parents figured out their situation. I was lucky enough to work from home, so watching my little brother wasn't too much of a burden, and it made me feel a lot better to have him there with me. My parents had a history of bad arguments, and I didn't want him to experience that harshness while growing up. This happened to me during this short 2-month time period. 2 weeks in, my job scheduled an in-person meeting to be held during the second half of our workday on a Friday afternoon. This was a normal monthly meeting that we had to discuss our progress on our projects. With my brother being so young, he of course needed a babysitter to watch him while I was gone. I called a local babysitting service that I found online and got it scheduled. I didn't choose a specific person, I just let them give me whoever was available at that time frame. Come Friday, I got my little brother ready and made sure everything was set on the counter for the babysitter. At noon, the babysitter, who I'll call Chris, came to the door of the apartment building. I buzzed him in and showed him inside. He looked to be between 18 and 20 years old, and from the few minutes I met him before I left, he seemed to be very caring and nice, just like any babysitter should be. I thanked him for helping me out and left for the meeting. The meeting took a few hours, and by 5:30 I was heading back home. In-person meetings always drained me because I was so used to working from home, so the drive back felt long and tiring. I parked by the front of the building and headed inside, then walked upstairs to my room. I unlocked the door, and immediately, something felt wrong. The lights were all off, and it was really quiet. "Chris?" I called out in the doorway. I stepped in and turned on the light. The worry hit me, and I got really scared. I ran down the hall into the living room. Right on the couch was my little brother. I gave him a big hug, then asked where Chris was. He said he left, but that was all I could get him to say. I called the babysitting company, but they said they hadn't heard anything from him either. They tried calling him, and he didn't answer. They apologized and gave me a refund for the service, but that really didn't make me feel better. Nothing looked to have been stolen though, and my brother was okay, so after an hour, I just dropped it. I made dinner for us and turned on a show for him to watch before bed. I started cleaning the dishes in the sink, which was facing the front door, when I had a sudden realization. I had to unlock the door when I got home. I never gave Chris keys to the house, and the only way to lock the bolt lock on the door was with the key, or from inside the house. I dropped what I was doing and grabbed my little brother, then ran out of the apartment. We sat in my car while I called the police. I saw one of the blinds in my bedroom window move while I was on the phone, and a minute later, Chris ran out of the front of the apartment building and got in his car, driving away. Police came, and later that night, Chris was found in his apartment. He made up a whole story, but it didn't make any sense and didn't fool anyone. It's likely that his plan was to do something to me later that night, then disappear. They found what they described as a travel kit in his car, with provisions, survival tools, and blankets. His apartment was also cleaned out, so he'd been planning on doing something like this for a while. This was definitely the most disturbing close call I've ever had. I'm glad it was just that though, a close call, because it could have been so much more disturbing than it already was if I hadn't gotten out in time. In high school, I had a group of friends that I did pretty much everything with. We always had something crazy we were doing on the weekend, and during the summer, we were doing things almost every night. During the summer of our junior year, one of my friends told us about an abandoned hospital. It was a 2-hour drive away from us, but all of us were intrigued. We'd explored abandoned buildings before, but none as big as a hospital. Of course, we drove there the following day. It was on the outskirts of a small city, where we drove through for some food before parking and walking a couple miles to the hospital. We arrived at the building around 1 a.m. when the city was quiet and still. Standing outside of it, it was just a rundown building, something that had been abandoned for years, but it had an eerie feeling that drew us in. Looking back, I can't believe we were so naive. We had no idea what we were getting ourselves into. We made our way towards the fence surrounding it. We slipped inside. The doors were obviously boarded up and locked, and so were all the windows. But one of my friends pointed out one window that had the board ripped off already. We climbed through the broken window and landed inside the hospital. Just as we entered, an extremely loud thud echoed through the hallways in the building. We assumed it was just the building being old, but now the silence following it was deafening. Looking around, the walls were crumbling and there was a musty smell that made it hard to breathe. We stayed grouped, not going further than a couple rooms from each other, as we walked through the hallways and looked around. I had no idea what I was looking for, but I felt like there had to be something hidden in this place, and I was determined to find it. From the inside, though, the hospital was really big. There were hundreds of rooms and hallways, and at some point, me and my friend Alex accidentally split apart from the other two. We didn't notice until we'd passed through several hallways. We turned back and tried to find them, but all the hallways and rooms looked the same.
Guys, you around here? Over here.
We heard them call out, but their voices echoed through all the rooms and the hallways, making it impossible to pinpoint their location. We walked in the direction we thought their voices were coming from, hoping that they would know the way back, because we were completely lost in this maze of hallways. As we wandered through a few rooms, I spotted a small light coming from under one of the closed doors. I walked over to it, leaning my ear against the door and listening. I didn't hear anything. I opened the door cautiously, immediately seeing a dim lamp sitting among a bunch of trash. Boxes, blankets, food wrappers, all piled up around this lamp, kind of like someone living there. I turned, about to call to Alex, when my eyes moved to the corner of the room. A man was standing there in the dark, pointing a gun right at me. He looked disgusting, and his eyes were shallow and empty. I slowly put my hands up and started backing away, apologizing quietly.
Who are you talking to?
Alex came up behind me, completely clueless. Once he saw the man, Alex ran away, and I followed after him. But suddenly my ears popped and rang. He shot at us. I continued following Alex, running through the hallways randomly, until we by chance ran into the other two friends. They were worried, having heard the gunshot, and we quickly explained we needed to leave. They led the way back to the broken window, and we got out of there as fast as we could. None of us were hurt, but Alex and I were traumatized. After that, we stayed away from isolated and abandoned places, knowing that there could be any crazy person living inside, ready to defend their self-claimed property without hesitation. I was driving home from a family gathering a few states away. I booked a hotel for the first night and planned to finish the drive the day after. During the drive, though, there were a few delays, the biggest one being the main highway blocked off for construction. This added a ton of extra driving to my route and even got me slightly lost for a while. Eventually, the sun was starting to set and I was really tired. I still had 5 hours to go, and I was frustrated with all the delays, which only made me more exhausted. I tried my best to stay awake and tough it through the last 5 hours, but the long, empty road made it impossible. I saw a sign on the side of the road for a motel 20 miles down and decided to stop there and finish the drive tomorrow. When I pulled in, there was only one other car in the parking lot, which I figured was the motel employee. I got out and went inside. An old lady was at the front counter on her phone when I walked in. "Just one row for the night, please," I said. She gave me a key and I went out to find the room. It was a single-story building, maybe having 10 to 15 rooms. I walked all the way down to the second to last room. I opened it up and turned on the lights. It was about as I'd expected, outdated and somewhat unsanitary looking. I guess that's what you get out in the middle of nowhere. I left everything in my car, literally planning to just sleep for a few hours and then hit the road again. I went back and locked the door, and as I walked over to the bed, I heard something from the room next to mine, a door closing, which in itself wasn't strange, but seeing as there were no other cars and the motel was out in the middle of nowhere, it puzzled me for a moment. I then heard them walk across the floor toward the wall that connected our rooms and then stop right next to it. If their room was laid out the same as mine, which I assume it was, then they were literally just standing against an empty wall. Regardless of whatever was going on in their room, I turned off the lights and got in bed, falling asleep pretty quickly. I jumped up to a knock at my door. I was a little unsettled and got up slowly, walking over to the door. "Hello?" I said. I opened the door. No one was there. I stepped outside and looked down at the rows of doors, seeing nothing unusual, and the parking lot was still empty. I went back inside and was even more confused now. Then I heard someone walking in the other room again, just moving around, almost sounding like they were packing or something. I got back in bed and tried to not worry about it. I lay there for a while, but couldn't really fall asleep. Maybe 30 minutes later, there was another knock at my door. This time when I got up, I checked the peephole and saw a woman standing there. I opened the door. "Can I help you? Why are you knocking at my door?" I asked in a fairly upset tone, being that it was so late. The woman said she was sorry, but she really needed my help with something in her room. Her eyes were bloodshot and she looked really tired. She pointed at the door next to mine. I asked what she needed help with, but she just said, "It's right here." I wasn't sure what that meant, but I stepped out and looked around the corner. She walked inside the room and turned around to face me when she reached the center, as if waiting for me to follow. There was a really creepy, eerie feeling that came in that second of silence as we looked at each other. I went back into my room and locked my door without saying anything. I heard her come back up to my door, trying to convince me to help her again, but I obviously ignored her. After about 30 seconds, I heard her go back to her room. Then I suddenly heard two men start arguing with her in that same room. I never saw either of them, so they must have been hiding. The three of them were yelling at each other for a minute. Then I heard the door swing open, and all of them running off. I called the police, but it took over 30 minutes for them to show up, and they were long gone by then. The lady working at the motel said she never checked anyone else in for the night, so they must have broken into that room. It's almost certain that it was a trap led by the woman to get me into the room, then get jumped by the two men. Who knows what would have happened after that? Every time I think of it, I think about how close I came to probably never being seen again. I deliver food on the weekends through DoorDash. I do it for the extra money, but also just to keep me busy, since I haven't had much going on in my life recently. Most of the time, the job is really boring and uneventful. I drive to the restaurant, grab the food, drop it off, and repeat. Anyways, on this Saturday night, I decided to start around 7 after I ate dinner. Things were pretty slow, only getting 1 or 2 good orders an hour. I didn't mind. I would just sit in my car and listen to music. An hour or so in, I got an order from a fast food place to be delivered 10 minutes away. I drove through and got the order, then started toward the destination. Right away though, I noticed it was a drop pin location, not an actual address. It was at a small park that I was actually familiar with. I knew high schoolers like to hang out there pretty late sometimes, as I used to live right by there. So I figured it was just a group wanting a midnight snack. A couple minutes into the drive, I got a call from the customer. A guy on the phone asked if I had the right location at the park. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I got it. Did you want to meet me in the parking lot? I asked. There was a pause. Sure. Then he hung up. A bit odd, but nothing to overthink. A few minutes later, I pulled into the small parking lot by the park. Upon first glance, it looked completely empty. No cars, no people. I knew the park was down a short path, so I couldn't actually see the main area. But still, I expected to see something. I texted the customer, letting him know that I was waiting in the parking lot. A couple seconds later, I get a text back, saying he'll meet me halfway down the path toward the park. This was weird, because he said he'd meet me here. Before getting out of my car, I left my wallet under my seat. Call me paranoid, but at least if it was some sort of robbery, I wouldn't lose anything. I grabbed the food, locked the car, and walked over to the front of the path. A ways down, I saw someone walking in my direction. I started walking toward them as well, giving a short wave to show I was their delivery driver. The person didn't react to my wave and just kept walking. For some reason, this made me uneasy, and I looked behind me, seeing someone else now walking toward my car in the parking lot. I watched them until I was sure they were going straight for my car. I looked back at the man down the path, who must have realized I was on to them, because he started sprinting at me. I ran back toward my car, yelling at the man who was now trying to open the doors. Once I got close, he started yelling for his friend to help, but surprisingly didn't run. I tossed the food and grabbed him, slamming him against the door. The guy was young, like me in high school or early college. He was struggling as I tossed him on the ground, away from my car. I looked back at the one from the path, who was still running at me, looking about ready to get in a full-on fight. But the one on the ground got up and ran away, and as soon as the other one noticed, he ran away too. My adrenaline was pumping as I got in my car and hurried away. I called the police, but nothing ever came of it. I'm just really glad that the one kid ran away, because if he hadn't, then it likely would have been an all-out fight, which wouldn't have ended well for any of us. After that, I never accepted any orders that weren't clearly being delivered to a safe address.